The machine did not hesitate. Its metal teeth pressed into the earth with the same certainty they had shown all morning, tearing through layers of soil that had long since forgotten the weight of daylight. The sound was constant, mechanical, deliberate, unthinking. Until it wasn't. There was a pause, subtle at first, as though the ground itself had resisted. Then a shift. I'd like to welcome you to the Veil of Forgotten Bloodline. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. You're part of something meaningful here, and we'd be honored to have you with us as we uncover more. Tell us where you're watching from. It helps us see how far these stories are traveling and how strong this family is becoming. You're not just a viewer here, you're part of the story. Let's proceed. The operator pulled back instinctively, not out of understanding, but because something in the motion no longer felt right. The bucket lifted, carrying with it a mixture of dirt and something that did not belong to the present. It fell back to the ground with a dull, uneven thud. No one spoke immediately. The site, which moments before had been alive with noise, settled into a silence that felt heavier than the earth itself. At first, it was difficult to see clearly. The soil clung to everything, obscuring shape and meaning, but as one of the workers stepped closer, brushing away the loose dirt with cautious hands, the outline became undeniable. It was not debris, it was not stone. It was something that had once been part of a person, something that had remained hidden long enough to be forgotten, yet intact enough to be recognized. The man froze. His breath caught somewhere between instinct and disbelief. Around him, the others gathered, their movements slower. Now their earlier confidence replaced by something uncertain. They had not been digging for this. Nothing in their instructions had prepared them for what the ground had chosen to reveal. The site supervisor arrived moments later, his expression controlled, his steps measured. He did not react immediately, not outwardly. Instead, he crouched slightly, examining what lay before him with the same focus he might give to any unexpected obstacle. But this was not an obstacle in the usual sense. It could not be moved, discarded, or ignored without consequence. The difference was understood, even if it was not yet spoken. He stood again, glancing briefly at the machinery, then at the workers, as if recalibrating the situation in real time. The project had a timeline. The land had a purpose. And yet, beneath that purpose, something older had surfaced, demanding recognition without asking for it. The morning air carried a stillness that did not belong to the usual rhythm of construction. Conversations, when they resumed, were quieter, fragmented. Someone mentioned calling it in. Someone else suggested it might not be necessary, that it could be handled internally. The uncertainty was not about what had been found. It was about what to do with it. The ground had interrupted progress, but progress had not yet decided how to respond. As the workers stepped back, the space around the discovery seemed to expand, as though the earth itself had created distance. What lay exposed was no longer just an isolated fragment. It suggested something more, something that extended beyond what could be seen in that single moment. The soil, once disturbed, did not return easily to its previous state. It held memory, layered and compressed over time, waiting not for permission, but for disruption. The narrative does not remain confined to the present. It moves backward, not abruptly, but as a gradual unfolding, revealing the land as it once was before it became a site of development. Long before machines carved into it, before roads traced lines across its surface, this space had been defined differently. It had been chosen, marked, and respected. The ground had been opened then as well, but not with force, rather with intention, with ceremony, with the understanding that what was placed within it would remain. Rows had existed here once, though not always in perfect alignment. Markers, some carved, others simple, had indicated where individuals were laid to rest. Families had gathered, not just once but repeatedly, returning to these spaces as part of a continuity that extended beyond a single generation. The land had been more than ground, it had been memory, connection, a place where the past was acknowledged and carried forward. But time does not preserve all things equally. What begins as presence can become absence when the structures that support it are removed. The communities that once maintained these burial grounds did not vanish in a single moment. Their displacement was gradual, shaped by forces that did not always announce themselves directly. Land was redefined, ownership shifted, priorities changed. What had once been central became peripheral, then eventually forgotten, not because it lacked importance, but because the systems surrounding it no longer recognized it. The markers disappeared first. Some were removed, others eroded, their inscriptions lost to weather and neglect. Without them, the land began to lose its visible identity. What remained beneath the surface did not change, but without acknowledgement above it, the connection weakened. Records, if they existed, were incomplete, scattered, or inaccessible. Knowledge that had once been shared within families and communities began to fade, not entirely, but enough to disrupt continuity. As decades passed, the land was reinterpreted. It was surveyed, measured, divided according to new purposes. The absence of visible markers allowed for a different narrative to take hold, one in which the ground appeared empty, unused. Available, development followed, not with the intent to erase, but with the assumption that there was nothing left to preserve. Foundations were laid, structures built, pathways carved. Each layer added to the surface pushed the past further out of sight, though never entirely out of existence. Back in the present, the construction site holds this layered history within a single moment. The fragment uncovered by the machine is not isolated. It is part of a larger whole that extends beyond the immediate area. The workers, though unaware of the full history, begin to sense this. The ground feels different now, not physically, but in meaning. What had been routine has become uncertain. The supervisor steps away briefly, making a call that is not fully heard. His tone is controlled, measured, conveying information without elaboration. The response on the other end is not visible, but its impact is. He returns with the same composed expression, though something in his posture suggests that the situation has shifted. Instructions are given: pause the work in this section, secure the area, wait for further direction. The language is procedural, but the weight behind it is not. The machinery stands still, its earlier motion suspended. The silence that replaces it is not empty. It carries the presence of what has been uncovered, as well as the suggestion of what remains hidden. The workers move more carefully now, their actions guided not just by instruction, but by awareness. The ground is no longer just material to be shaped. It is something else entirely, something that has interrupted the present with the past. And as the scene settles, one thing becomes clear, not in full detail, but in undeniable feeling. This is not the first time something like this has been uncovered, and it will not be the last. The land remembers even when everything above it forgets. The ground did not begin as empty, no matter how it would later be described. Long before the machines arrived, before the surveys and measurements reduced it to coordinates on paper, it had already been defined, carefully, deliberately, and with meaning that extended beyond the visible. The land had been chosen not for convenience, but for permanence. It was set apart, marked in ways that were understood by those who lived within its reach, even if those markings would not endure the passage of time. In its earliest form, the space held a quiet order, not rigid, not imposed, but shaped by repetition and memory. The first burials were conducted with intention, each one reinforcing the significance of the ground itself. The earth was opened slowly, not with force, but with care. There was an understanding, unspoken yet deeply held, that what was placed within it would remain part of the land, and that the land in turn would carry it forward. This was not simply a place of burial, it was a place of continuity. Over time, the rows expanded. They did not always align perfectly, nor were they required to. Each space reflected the presence of a life that had been known, connected to others who would return, who would remember, who would ensure that the ground remained more than just soil. Markers were placed, some carved from stone, others made from materials that would not last as long. Names were inscribed where possible, though not always with permanence. What mattered was not only what was written, but what was known. Families gathered here, not only in moments of loss, but in moments of connection. The act of returning became part of the rhythm of life itself. Paths formed naturally between the graves, worn into the ground by repeated visits. Stories were shared in quiet voices, passed from one generation to the next, linking the present to those who had come before. The land held these moments, absorbing them into its layers, preserving them not in words, but in presence. But continuity depends on more than memory alone. It depends on stability, on the ability of a community to remain connected to the space that defines it. When that stability begins to shift, the connection weakens, not immediately, but gradually. The changes did not arrive all at once. They came in stages, each one altering the relationship between people and land in ways that were not always visible at first. Ownership of the surrounding areas began to change. Boundaries were redrawn, sometimes formally, sometimes through actions that did not require official recognition to take effect. The land that had once been central to a community's identity became less accessible. Not through direct removal, but through subtle displacement. Roads were introduced where there had been none. Properties expanded, encroaching on spaces that had once been left undisturbed. The burial ground remained, but its position shifted, not physically, but in significance. What had once been a focal point became something peripheral, then something overlooked. The markers, already vulnerable to time, began to deteriorate. Some were removed intentionally, others lost to weather, their inscriptions fading until they could no longer be read. Without them, the visible structure of the cemetery weakened. Records, where they existed, were not always preserved. Some had never been formalized, existing instead within the knowledge of those who maintained the land. As that knowledge became fragmented, so too did the understanding of what lay beneath the surface. Names were forgotten. Locations became uncertain. The land, though unchanged in its contents, began to lose its identity in the eyes of those who no longer recognized it. The transition from recognized space to overlooked ground did not require a single defining moment. It happened through accumulation, through the gradual erosion of visibility, through the shifting of priorities that placed development above preservation. What had once been protected by presence was now exposed to reinterpretation. Surveyors arrived at some point, their purpose defined by measurement rather than memory. They viewed the land not as it had been, but as it appeared in that moment. Without visible markers, without accessible records, the ground presented itself as open, unclaimed, available for use. Lines were drawn, maps created, each one reinforcing a new understanding of the space. What lay beneath the surface was not accounted for. Not because it was hidden, but because it was no longer recognized. Development followed naturally from this redefinition. Structures were planned, foundations prepared, the land reshaped to serve a different purpose. The act of building did not begin with the intent to erase. It began with the assumption that there was nothing left to preserve, and within that assumption the past was not confronted. It was simply bypassed. The first layers of construction altered the surface, but not what lay beneath it. The soil was disturbed, shifted, compressed, yet it retained its contents. Over time, additional layers were added: roads, buildings, pathways, all contributing to a new landscape that bore little resemblance to what had once existed. The burial ground did not disappear, it was covered. As the years passed, the new structures became part of daily life. People moved through these spaces without awareness of what lay below. Schools were built where families once gathered in mourning. Roads cut across areas that had once been defined by memory and connection. Buildings rose, their foundations resting on ground that still held its original purpose, even if that purpose was no longer acknowledged. The absence of visible markers allowed this transformation to continue without interruption. Without evidence at the surface, there was little reason to question what lay beneath. The land adapted to its new role, not by changing, but by being reinterpreted. The past remained intact, but it existed outside the awareness of those who now occupied the space. Yet, the ground does not forget. What had been placed within it remained unchanged by the structures above. Time altered the surface, but not the presence beneath it. And while the system that had redefined the land operated without recognition of this, the potential for rediscovery remained. Not constant, not predictable, but inevitable. Back in the present, the construction site reflects this inevitability. The fragment uncovered by the machine is not an anomaly. It is a continuation of what has always existed beneath the surface. The workers, though unaware of the full history, now stand at a point where the past has intersected with the present in a way that cannot be ignored. The silence that follows the discovery carries more than uncertainty. It carries the weight of what has been overlooked, of what has been built over without acknowledgement. The land, once again disturbed, has revealed a part of itself that had remained hidden, not by intention, but by neglect. And as the scene holds on this moment, the connection between past and present becomes undeniable. What was once known, then forgotten, has begun to surface again. Not fully, not completely, but enough to challenge the assumption that it no longer exists. The ground, layered with history, does not erase what it holds. It waits. And when disturbed, it answers. The interruption did not end when the machine stopped. It lingered, spreading quietly through the site in ways that could not be measured by noise or motion. What had been uncovered was no longer just an object in the ground. It had altered the meaning of everything around it. The workers, who had once moved with confidence and rhythm, now adjusted their steps without fully realizing it. Their voices remained low, their conversations shortened, as though something unspoken had entered the space and taken hold. The area around the discovery was marked off, not with urgency, but with caution. Temporary barriers were placed, simple and functional, creating a boundary between what had been found and what continued beyond it. Yet the boundary did not contain the awareness. It extended outward, reaching into the surrounding work zones, into the machinery that now stood idle, into the ground itself, which no longer felt uniform. Each patch of soil carried the possibility of more, of repetition, of continuation beneath the surface. The supervisor remained near the site longer than before, his presence no longer just procedural. He watched the ground with a focus that suggested calculation, not just of what had been uncovered, but of what it implied. The call he had made earlier had set something in motion, though its effects had not yet arrived. There was a waiting now, but it was different from the waiting of the morning. It was not passive. It carried expectation, uncertainty, and the recognition that the next step would not be as simple as resuming work. Elsewhere on the site, smaller movements continued. Tools were gathered, adjusted, repositioned, but without the urgency that had driven them before. The rhythm had been disrupted, and in its place was a slower, more deliberate pace. One of the workers moved along the edge of the marked area, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if trying to read it, as if the surface might reveal something more if he looked closely enough. He was not searching for anything specific. He did not know what he might find, But the idea that something existed beneath what he could see had taken hold, and it did not leave easily. The narrative shifts again, not backward this time, but outward, extending beyond the single site into other places where similar moments have occurred. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in fragments, separate events connected by pattern. A road project halted when bones surfaced beneath asphalt that had been laid decades earlier. A school expansion paused when excavation revealed remains that had not been recorded. A foundation dug for a new building uncovered fragments that forced a brief reconsideration before work resumed. Each moment had its own response, shaped by time, by location, by the systems in place to address such discoveries. But what remained consistent was the pattern itself, the interruption, the brief acknowledgement, the decision that followed. In some cases, the work stopped for longer periods. In others, it resumed quickly, the discovery documented, contained, and moved past. The surface adapted, the structures remained. The past, once uncovered, was addressed just enough to allow the present to continue. Back at the site, the waiting begins to take form. A vehicle arrives not with urgency, but with purpose. The individuals who step out carry a different presence, one shaped not by construction, but by interpretation. They move toward the marked area, their focus directed, their actions measured. The workers step back, not instructed to do so, but understanding that the space now belongs to something beyond their role. The examination begins quietly. The soil is approached with care, not force. Tools are smaller now, more precise, designed to reveal rather than remove. Each movement is deliberate, each layer uncovered with attention. The process is slower, but it carries a different kind of momentum, one that seeks understanding rather than completion. What was once a site of progress has become, if only briefly, a site of discovery. As more of the ground is exposed, the initial fragment is no longer alone. It connects to others, forming a pattern that extends outward. The suggestion becomes certainty. This is not a single occurrence. It is part of a larger presence, one that had remained intact beneath the surface, despite everything that had been built above it. The land, once interpreted as empty, now reveals itself as occupied, not by the present, but by what has endured within it. The workers watch from a distance, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet recognition. They do not have the language to fully describe what they are seeing, but they understand enough to know that the ground they had been working on is no longer just a site. It is something else, something that carries weight beyond their immediate task. The supervisor stands apart, observing both the process and its implications. The timeline he had been managing no longer holds the same certainty. The land has introduced a variable that cannot be easily accounted for. Decisions will need to be made, not just about this moment, but about what comes next. Whether the work will continue, how it will continue, and what will be done with what has been uncovered. All of it now exists within a different framework. The narrative lingers on this intersection, where past and present meet not in theory, but in physical reality. The structures built above have not erased what lies beneath. They have only covered it, temporarily, until something disrupts the surface enough to reveal it again. The pattern is not isolated. It extends across places, across time, repeating in ways that are not always acknowledged, but are always present. As the scene settles, the site remains paused. The machinery stands still, the barriers remain in place, and the examination continues at its own pace. The ground, once disturbed, does not return to silence easily. It holds what it has revealed and what it has yet to reveal within the same space. And in that space, one realization becomes impossible to ignore, not through explanation, but through presence. This land is not empty, it never was. The work does not stop everywhere, it never has. What pauses in one place continues in another, And the system that shapes these decisions does not depend on a single site to sustain itself. The construction zone, now partially silent, exists alongside others that remain active, their machines cutting into the ground with the same certainty that defined the morning before the interruption. The difference is not in the action but in the awareness. What has been uncovered here begins to cast a quiet shadow over what continues elsewhere. Not visible, not acknowledged, but present, at the marked site. The examination has progressed beyond the initial discovery. The careful work of uncovering reveals more than fragments. It reveals structure. The alignment of remains, the spacing between them, the depth at which they rest. Each detail confirms what had only been suggested before. This was not random. It was not incidental. It was organized, intentional, and once recognized. The land, stripped of its surface layers, begins to resemble what it had been before it was forgotten, though only in pieces, only in glimpses that require interpretation to fully understand. Those conducting the examination move with quiet focus, their actions shaped by a different purpose than those who had first disturbed the ground. Their work is not driven by completion, but by understanding. Yet, even this understanding has limits. What can be revealed is only what remains intact, what has been lost to time, to earlier disruptions, to the initial layers of construction, cannot be restored. The gaps within the ground mirror the gaps within the record, partial, incomplete, yet enough to suggest the whole. Around the perimeter, the workers continue to observe, their presence now that of witnesses rather than participants. The site no longer belongs to their task. It has shifted into something that exists outside the usual sequence of construction and completion. The supervisor remains in place, his role altered by circumstance. The calls he makes now are different in tone, less about scheduling, more about consultation. The language has changed, not dramatically, but enough to reflect the shift in responsibility. Beyond the site, the narrative expands once more, drawing attention to the spaces where no interruption has yet occurred. Roads stretch across land that appears stable, complete, uninterrupted. Buildings stand where foundations were laid without resistance. Schools, homes, public spaces, each one carrying the weight of its purpose, unaware of what may exist beneath it. The surface tells a story of progress, of development, of continuity. But the ground beneath holds a different story, one that remains out of view until something forces it into the present. Families who once knew these spaces do not always know where to find them now. The knowledge that was passed down has thinned, fragmented by time, by movement, by the loss of connection to the land itself. Some remember only in pieces stories without locations, names without markers. Others search, tracing records that do not fully align, walking spaces that no longer resemble what they once were. The absence is not just physical, it is informational, historical, a gap between what was and what can still be known. Occasionally, the ground answers these uncertainties. A project begins, the earth is disturbed, and something surfaces. Each discovery carries the same initial confusion, the same pause, the same need to decide what comes next. The responses vary, shaped by the systems in place at the time. Some sites are preserved, their significance acknowledged, their boundaries redefined to protect what remains. Others are documented briefly, the findings recorded, then recovered, allowing the original purpose of the project to continue. Back at the construction site, the decision has not yet been fully resolved. The examination continues, but the question of what follows lingers. The land has revealed its history, but the present must decide how to respond to it. The structures planned for this space now exist alongside the knowledge of what lies beneath. The two realities do not cancel each other out. They coexist, creating a tension that does not resolve easily. The camera lingers on the exposed ground, where the pattern of the burial site is now partially visible. It is not complete, it cannot be. but it is enough to confirm what had been hidden. The arrangement, once defined by markers that no longer exist, is now defined by the ground itself. It tells its story without words, without records, without the need for confirmation beyond its own presence. The workers begin to disperse slowly, not returning to their tasks, but stepping away from the space that no longer belongs to their routine. The machinery remains still, its purpose suspended. The supervisor stands for a moment longer, looking out over the site, not at the progress that has been made, but at the interruption that has changed it. His expression does not reveal a conclusion. It reflects a process that is still unfolding. The narrative does not close with resolution. It settles into awareness. The site remains, the examination continues. The decision is pending. Beyond it, other sites remain active, other grounds undisturbed, for now. The pattern does not end here. It extends outward beneath cities, beneath structures, beneath the everyday movement of life that continues without knowledge of what lies below. And as the scene fades, one question remains, not answered, not resolved, but present in a way that cannot be ignored. How much of the past still exists beneath the surface, waiting not to be found, but to be uncovered again?